So I'm recording the lecture, so I will try to post this on YouTube afterwards, and I'll send everybody a link to it as well, okay? The lectures we're going over today, we're going to finish talking about social cognition, which are the biases and heuristics that we've been talking about. We're then going to talk about attributions, which is the second part of social cognition, and then we're going to talk about attitudes. Okay, so let me share my screen with you guys. Oh, hold on one second. Okay, well, I've apparently discovered a problem here, which is that I cannot share my screen without admin privileges on my laptop, and it's a new laptop, and I have not been granted admin privileges yet, which means I can't share my screen. Give me 1 second. I'll come right back. Okay, hold on. All right, guys, just give me 2 or 3 minutes. I'm having someone remote in so I can share my screen. Just hold on. Okay. Sorry about that, guys. Things should be working out. I did not expect that to happen, and I apologize to Christian for wearing pants at home. Um, okay, so you guys clearly can hear me. Everything seems to be working other than that, right? So I think you should be able to share my screen now. All right, so you guys should be able to see this, I imagine. All right, everything's good? Perfect. Okay, great. Fantastic. What I want to do first off then is go to TopPad. If you remember last class, I had you answer a question for me about the length of the Mississippi River. That's what I'm going to right now. So I asked people with odd birthdays and even birthdays separately how long the Mississippi River is, and the odd birthday people tended to say that it was less than 2,000 miles. And the even birthday people tended to say that it was more than 2,000 miles. And so the question is, why were you guys giving me different estimates? What's going on here? In order to answer that question, that's going to require us to talk about a new type of heuristic that we have not yet discussed in class. Okay. Something known as the anchoring and adjustment heuristic. Okay, now the anchoring and adjustment heuristic is remember that a heuristic is simply a shortcut cognitive judgment that we make, right? So instead of having to calculate something, instead of having to engage in a lot of in-depth cognitive effort to answer a question, we instead rely on what are known as heuristics, these shortcut judgments. And so we talked about the availability heuristic last class. To refresh your memory, the availability heuristic is the heuristic whereby when you're estimating how frequently something happens, how common something is, then what we do is we try to think of examples of that thing. And if we can easily think of examples, then we assume that thing happens a lot, right? And if we can't think of examples of that thing happening, we assume it doesn't happen very much at all. So the anchoring and adjustment heuristic is a second heuristic that we're going to talk about. But the anchoring and adjustment heuristic only really applies when we're trying to come up with a numeric estimate for something. And the question is, how do we come up with that numeric estimate? So for instance, let's say I asked you the following question. So you know that water freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit. And so the question is, at what temperature does vodka freeze? And actually, if you guys want to take a guess, you can just write your guesses in the chat. Yeah, it doesn't freeze is one of the most popular answers. It's wrong. It will freeze. If you get anything cold enough, it'll freeze, right? Anything. Now, what you're probably thinking is that, you might be at home and you have a bottle of vodka in your freezer and it's not frozen, right? So you think it doesn't freeze. But I promise you, if you get it cold enough, it will freeze. So I've got a couple guesses of 0, 15 degrees, 20 degrees, -4, -15. Yeah, it depends on the purity of the vodka. Do I write the answer here? No. In general, it freezes somewhere between, I think it's between -16 and -40 is when it freezes, okay? But what you guys did is your estimates that you guys gave. So I saw -10, -15, 0, -4, 15 degrees. The estimates that you guys are giving are exactly what we tend to see, the estimates that people give, okay? Here's the basic idea of how this works. So when you're trying to estimate a numerical value, like the temperature at which vodka freezes, the first thing that we tend to do is we look for what's called an anchor. This is a known numeric value, right? So you know that water freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit. That's your anchor, okay? And you also know that vodka doesn't freeze in your freezer, but water does. So you know that vodka must freeze at a temperature lower than 32 degrees Fahrenheit. So you've got to adjust your estimate based off of that anchor. You've got to adjust it downwards, right? What we tend to see, though, is that when people engage in anchoring and adjustments, they don't adjust enough from the anchor, okay? And that's exactly what we saw here in this class. So if the anchor is 32 degrees Fahrenheit, and the true answer for what temperature vodka freezes is like -16 to -40, but people don't adjust enough. So they give estimates that are, in this case, somewhat too high, like 0 or -10 or 15 degrees or whatever it is, right? That's a common characteristic that when people use the anchoring and adjustment heuristic is that they're not adjusting enough from the initial anchor that's being given. And so let me describe to you a study, and I want to relate it back to the Mississippi River at the end, okay? So this is a study where researchers asked people the following question, which is, what percentage of African countries are in the United Nations? Okay, now this is probably some trivia that most people don't know, right? Probably, I imagine no one knows the percentage of African countries. So people have to give this numeric estimate. So before the researchers asked people this question, the first thing that they did is they obtained a random number. Now, this random number, they basically created this kind of like a roulette wheel, but they modified it a little bit. So the numbers range between, I think, like between 0 and 100. And they spin this wheel to get this random number. The participants believe it's random. In reality, the whole thing is rigged. And so it only comes up on one of two numbers. It either comes up on the number 10 or the number 65. Okay. So participants are randomly assigned for this random number to come up as either 10 or 65. And then once it does, they first ask people the following question, which is the actual number, is the percentage of African countries that are in the UN, is it higher or lower than this supposedly random number? And then once people responded to that, then they asked people for their estimate of what percentage of African countries are in the UN. Now, if you think about this, the number that comes up, whether it's 10 or 65, whatever that random number is, right, shouldn't matter. It shouldn't have any influence on your decision, on your final estimate of what percentage of African countries are in the UN, because it has nothing to do with it, right? And yet what we tend to find is that when the random number that comes up was 10, then people estimated that about 25% of African countries were in the UN. And on the other hand, if the random number was 65, then people estimated that 45% of African countries were in the UN. But that doesn't seem to make any sense, right? I mean, again, that random number has nothing to do with the actual answer. So why is it that giving people a different random number changes the final estimate that they give? And the reason for this is because when we have to estimate this numerical value and we're searching for an anchor, sometimes we don't have an anchor. Like we had an anchor when we had to estimate the temperature at which vodka froze, because you know that water freezes at 32, right? So you have this inborn, this natural anchor. But with this question, we don't have an anchor. But people still search for one anyway, and they will grab onto whatever numerical anchor that is given to them. And so this random number basically serves as an anchor to them. And they adjust their estimates based off of that anchor. And as a consequence, if they're given a higher anchor, so they're given 65 instead of 10 as the random number, their final estimate of the percentage of African countries that are in the UN tends to be influenced by that initial anchor. It tends to be higher, which is exactly what we're seeing here. And that basically is what happened with you guys last class. So when I asked the odd birthday people about the Mississippi River, like the Mississippi River, everybody had two questions they had to respond to. And the second question was the same for everybody. It was, how long is the river, right? What varied across the people who had even birthdays and odd birthdays was this first question that I'd asked them. So the odd birthday people were asked the following question: is the Mississippi River longer or shorter than 500 miles? The even birthday people, on the other hand, were first asked whether the Mississippi River is longer or shorter than 3,000 miles. Other than that, you guys were exactly the same, right? And what we're seeing here, just like we see with the example from the UN, is that when the even birthday people are given a higher anchor, okay, then they're giving a higher estimate. The majority of those people think the river is greater than 2,000 miles. If people are given a lower anchor, that 500-mile anchor, such as the odd birthday people, then you tend to think that the Mississippi River was less than 2,000 miles. Okay, so your estimates of how long the Mississippi River was were basically, they're basically a function of this initial anchor that you were given, even though that anchor was basically completely arbitrary, right? Whether I asked you whether the Mississippi River is greater or shorter than 3,000 miles or 500 miles doesn't really have an impact on what your estimate should be, and yet it did, right? Because you grabbed onto an anchor. So that's why we see that discrepancy in that in your estimates of the Mississippi River, because of the anchoring and adjustment heuristic. Okay, now let's imagine the following as well. What I want you to do is to calculate this as quickly as possible. Okay, and your time is up. Now you've got to give, let's say, an estimate of what the product of that value was. Okay, now I'm not actually going to have you do that at the moment, but you could come up with some sort of estimate if you wanted to, right? And let's say that I'm teaching a second section of this social psychology class. And in the second section of the class, I have them do the exact same task, except I give them the following product. Okay. I give them the same amount of time to try to calculate this in their heads, and then I take it away, and then they have to give me their estimates. Now, what happens, of course, the first sequence of numbers that I gave you, 1 times 2 times 3 times 4, etc., you know that that product, whatever this equals, is going to be equivalent to the second sequence, right? 8 times 7 times 6 times 5, etc., because you're just reordering the numbers. And you know that when you multiply, it doesn't matter if you multiply 2 times 3 or 3 times 2. It doesn't matter the order in which you multiply them, right? You're going to get the same answer. So we know that the actual true answer to both of these equations is exactly the same. And yet, when you first ask people to give their estimate for what the product is in the first sequence, the median answer, and the median is basically means it's the value that's right in the middle of all the values that people give. The median is the one that's right in the middle. Okay, so the median answer for the first sequence is about 512. The median answer for the second sequence is 2,250, like drastically different, right? Now, why is that the case? Why are people giving different estimates of this product? Well, the reason is this. If I give you this first product here, what most people tend to do is they calculate the first few terms, right? 1 times 2 is 2, 2 times 3 is 6, 6 times 4 is 24, 24 times 5 is 120, and then I take it away, right? So basically, you're at an anchor. You're at 120. That's what you're at so far, but there's a few more numbers to multiply. So that's your anchor. Your anchor is 120, and you've got to adjust upwards from that anchor, right? But in the second sequence, what happens, people start multiplying these numbers and they say, okay, 8 times 7 is 56, 56 times 6 is 336, and then it disappears. So 336 is the anchor for some of these people. And they know there's a few more terms afterwards, so they've got to adjust it upwards from there. But the point is, the second group of people who see this equation, the second equation, they're starting at a higher anchor. They're starting at like 336 or whatever it is, instead of 120 that the first people are starting at. So because they're starting at a higher anchor, they end up with a higher initial estimate, which is why they end up with the estimate of over 2,000, whereas the first people who saw that first equation end up with only an estimate of 512, right? So we're first off seeing that the anchor that you have, your starting point, makes a big difference in terms of what your final estimate actually is. That's one of the key characteristics of the anchoring and adjustment heuristic, is that your final estimate depends on your initial anchor. And the second key aspect of the anchoring and adjustment heuristic is that when people adjust from that anchor, as I mentioned before, they tend not to adjust enough. So the actual answer to these equations is over 40,000, okay? You could see that whether people were given the first sequence or the second sequence, they simply didn't adjust enough from the initial anchor they were given, right? As a consequence, their estimates were much too small. Okay, so that's the anchoring and adjustment heuristic. Again, that's usually comes into play when we're trying to estimate a numeric value for something. A third heuristic I want to discuss is something known as the representativeness heuristic. This one's a little bit trickier, I think. But let me go over it. First off, let me start with a question. Imagine flipping a coin 10 times in a row, okay? And then you record the sequence of heads and tails. And so let's say that I'm asking the following question. Which of the following two outcomes is more likely to actually occur? So the first outcome is heads, tails, tails, heads, tails, heads, heads, tails, tails, heads. And the second outcome is heads, 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 heads. And you can type in the chat which one you think is more likely, which outcome, 1 or 2. Okay, so most people are saying outcome 1, right? Okay. Oh, there we go. I was waiting for someone to say it. All right, the right answer is that they're exactly equally likely to happen. Okay. 1 is not more likely to occur than 2, although most people think it is. But you can think about it this way, right? So what's the likelihood that you're going to get sequence 1? Well, if you're flipping a coin, you know, it's a 50% chance of coming up heads, a 50% chance of coming up tails. So your chance of getting a heads in the first flip is 50%. And the chance of getting a tails in your second flip is 50%. And the chance of getting a tails in your third flip is 50%, et cetera. It's 50% every single flip, right? Well, what's the odds of the second sequence happening? Well, you've got to get a heads on your first flip, that's 50%, times a heads on your second flip, which is 50%, times a heads on your third flip, which is 50%, etc. Again, on any individual flip, it's a 50% likelihood of coming up the exact heads or tails, whatever that you need, right? As a consequence, the actual probabilities of getting these two outcomes are completely identical. Okay. And so the question then becomes, well, if they are identical, then why is it that most people think at a gut level that the first sequence is more common, that is more likely, right? Like, what are you doing cognitively that led you to the conclusion that the first sequence was more likely? That's what we're going to look at. I can phrase this in a slightly different way. Okay, let's imagine that you are going to buy a lottery ticket. And let's say this lottery involves you picking, I think it's like 7 numbers between 1 and 50 or something like that. Okay. And when you get there, there's only 2 lottery tickets left. Okay. The first lottery ticket has the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And the second lottery ticket has the numbers 3, 7, 11, 15, 22, 29, 34. And the question, just like in the last example I gave, the question here is which one of these 2 lottery tickets is more likely to win? Well, you kind of know the secret here. They're in fact exactly equally likely to win, right? But if you were to ask a sample of 100 people, which of these 2 lottery tickets is more likely to win, what do you think they would tend to say? The first one or the second one? 2, right? Yeah, the second, of course. People are going to overwhelmingly say that the second sequence of coin flips is more likely to happen, right? Even though they're exactly equally likely to win. So again, what is leading people to these incorrect conclusions? What's even more interesting, I think, is that if you are selling these tickets, not only do people not understand that they're equally likely to win, people will actually pay more money for the second lottery ticket. My guess is you could charge 2 or 3 times as much for the second lottery ticket as for the first one, and you'd still get people taking that second lottery ticket. But why? Why would people engage in sort of suboptimal behavior? We're going to come back to that in just a second. I also want you to imagine the following scenario. Oh, and hang on, I just see that someone raised their hand. Hold on one second. Let me call on you. Okay, you can unmute yourself there, Mayor.
Yeah, doesn't it make more sense that even though they're equally likely, they're all 1 out of 50. I don't think it's ever happened that the lottery's ever been 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Would that not be a reason why people would want to do it more because it's something that's never happened?
Well, let me ask you a question, Mayor. Has there ever been a lottery where the winning numbers are 3, 7, 11, 15, 22, 29, 34?
I don't know.
I mean, what? But my point is the likelihood that that specific lottery ticket has won is extremely unlikely as well, right? In fact, it's the same level of unlikeliness. It feels as if it's more likely, right? That's kind of what you're saying, is that it kind of feels like it's more likely. And what you're kind of getting at is the reason behind why people are led to the wrong answer here. So let me come back to that.
Yeah.
Okay, imagine the following scenario. Imagine I've got a description of 100 people. Okay, 30 of these people are lawyers and 70 of them are engineers. And so for each person, there's a piece of paper. I write a little description of that person. I fold it up, I put it in a big bowl. Okay, I then shake up the bowl and I draw one out at random. And let's say that the description I pulled out at random says the following. Twice divorced, Frank spends most of his free time hanging around the country club. His clubhouse bar conversations often center around his regrets at having tried to follow his father's footsteps. The long hours he had spent at academic drudgery would have been better invested in learning how to be less quarrelsome in his relations with other people. And the question for you is, what do you think Frank is? Do you think that Frank, is a lawyer or an engineer? Now, keep in mind that Frank's not a real person, right? So there's no right or wrong answer to this question, okay? So you don't have to worry about putting in the wrong answer. But what does your gut tell you? Does your gut tell you that Frank is a lawyer or an engineer? So write it in the chat, whatever you think. Okay, so looks like overwhelmingly people would say lawyer for this. Okay. Now, as I said, there's no right or wrong answer. If you think he's a lawyer or an engineer, you can't be right or wrong because Frank doesn't actually exist, right? But let me ask you the following question. Let's say that in some alternative section of SOP 3004, okay, a different section that I'm teaching, I give them this exact same problem, except I make one change. Oops. And the change I make is this. Instead of there being initially 30 lawyers and 70 engineers in the pool of 100 people, let's say that for my second class, I change the numbers. So there's 70 lawyers and 30 engineers. Okay, so I'm just swapping the 30 and the 70 around. Okay. My question to you is, do you think that in that other class, they would be more likely, less likely to think that Frank is a lawyer, or would it not make a difference? And feel free to type your guesses into chat. So if there are 70 lawyers and 30 engineers, would people be more or less likely to think Frank is a lawyer? Okay, so I'm seeing a lot of no difference. Okay, actually, Gabriella, you said something that's perfect. When you said people would probably pay more attention to the paragraph description than the odds, that's exactly right. What would happen is that if I gave this exact description in my other class and I swapped 30 and 70 around, that would make almost no difference on people's estimates. However, I could prove to you mathematically that it should make a difference. Now, I'm not going to, because that requires understanding like something called Bayesian statistics, which most of you probably don't know. But I could prove to you mathematically that whether there were 30 lawyers to begin with or whether there were 70 lawyers to begin with makes a huge difference on the likelihood that Frank is a lawyer. However, when you had to estimate, when you had to guess whether you thought Frank was a lawyer or not, you probably didn't really consider that information. Probably what most of you did is you read this description of Frank and you compared that description to a typical lawyer and to a typical engineer. And for most people, they would say, well, let's see, is that a country club? It sounds like something a lawyer would go to. Academic drudgery, that kind of sounds maybe like law school. He's quarrelsome, lawyers like to argue. So a lot of people might have thought, okay, so he's probably more likely to be a lawyer, right? But also keep in mind that only 30 out of 100 people were lawyers to begin with, right? And as I said, I could show you mathematically that the actual likelihood that Frank is a lawyer depends very heavily on the initial likelihood that he's a lawyer to begin with. And the initial likelihood is only about 30% in the first case, right? In other words, what I'm saying is that people should be considering that information, the 30 versus 70, but they almost never do. That's not what you guys, probably most of you did. That's probably not what most of you did, right? You compared Frank to a typical lawyer and a typical engineer. And that is why if I change these numbers for a different section of my social psychology class, people would give the same likelihood that Frank is a lawyer, even though it would actually be very, very different, the actual likelihoods. So what you did here is, if I describe correctly what you did to come up with your conclusion, is you engaged in what's called the representativeness heuristic. Okay. The representativeness heuristic occurs when we're trying to decide if something belongs in category A or category B. Oops. And the way that we do that is we compare the thing to a typical member in each of those categories, right? So if you're trying to decide if Frank is a lawyer or an engineer, you compare Frank to a typical lawyer and to a typical engineer, and you assume he's part of the category that he resembles the typical person, right? If he resembles a typical lawyer, you assume he's a lawyer. But what you didn't do is you did not consider the base rates. And by base rates in this case, that just means these numbers, the 30 and 70. You probably didn't factor those numbers into your probabilities, even though you should have. So we saw at the very end of last class, in fact, that people tend to be insensitive to base rates. We talked about that in relation to the availability heuristic, okay? And the same thing is happening here, that people ignore the actual statistical base rate information when making these judgments, and that can lead them to make wrong conclusions. And so if we go back a few slides, when you had to determine which of those sequence of coin flips is more likely, what you probably did is you thought, well, the first sequence looks more like a sequence of random coin flips, because usually in a sequence of random coin flips, you get a bunch of heads, a bunch of tails, right? And the first sequence of coin flips looks more like that. It looks more random. Now, it's not more random, as I said, but the exact same probability, right? But because it looks more random, people assumed it was more random and therefore more likely to actually occur. And that is why people gave the wrong answer for this question. And in the second question, the same thing happens, right? The second lottery ticket looks more like a winning ticket because when you look at a winning lottery ticket, you tend not to see tickets that have 7 numbers in a row, right? They're just kind of randomly spaced out. Now, that's not because the second lottery ticket is actually objectively more likely to win, but because it looks more random, it looks more like a typical winning lottery ticket, people assume it's actually more likely to win when in fact it's not. Okay. So we assume something is part of a category if it resembles a typical member of that category. We assume this lottery ticket is more likely to win because it resembles a typical winning lottery ticket. And the main point is that we ignore that statistical base rate information. And this is something that happens all the time, not just in these heuristics, but all the time. When we make judgments, when we make decisions, we tend not to be very influenced by statistical base rate information. It's not very salient to us, right? And as a consequence, we tend to be more influenced by things like the availability heuristic and representativeness heuristic because we're ignoring that statistical information. And these sorts of heuristics apply not just in terms of these, esoteric games, these random games that I'm showing you here, but they apply in the real world as well, because they apply to how we perceive people. And it's partly for this reason that some people in this country, when you show them someone that is dressed in, let's say, Middle Eastern clothing, some people in this country will think that that means that this person is quite likely to be a terrorist if they associate terrorists with people from the Middle East, let's say after 9/11 or something, okay? Now, in reality, of course, that is not true at all. And the reason is because according to the base rates, the statistical information, the vast, vast, vast majority of people who dress in Middle Eastern clothes like this person are not terrorists, obviously, right? But if people have this idea that a terrorist looks Middle Eastern and a non-terrorist looks, I don't know, Western, in Western clothes, then when they see someone with Middle Eastern clothes, they assume they're part of that category, that they're part of the terrorists, right? Because they ignore the statistical information that shows that, in fact, they're overwhelmingly unlikely to be a terrorist. And so these heuristics that people rely on feed into things like stereotypes and prejudice. And when we come back and talk about stereotypes and prejudice near the end of the semester, we're going to come back to some of these heuristics. But for now, you don't need to know that in depth at the moment. We'll come back to it. But for now, just understand what these heuristics are, when we use them, and why they lead us to wrong conclusions. All right, one more I want to talk about briefly. This is something that happens a lot as well, is that people form what are known as illusory correlations. Okay. An illusory correlation occurs when someone believes that two things are related when in fact they're not related at all. And we saw some of these last class, as a matter of fact, when I talked about the belief that some people have that weird things are more likely to happen during a full moon, or the belief that sugar causes hyperactivity in kids. Those are beliefs that two things are related when in fact they're not. And those sorts of illusory correlations can arise as a consequence of many of the other biases and heuristics that we discussed. So for instance, let's imagine that you've got a friend, Jane. You haven't seen Jane in a number of years, okay? But there were a number of times, let's say that there were 3 different times over the past year where you thought about Jane and she called you that same day. And on the basis of those 3 instances, you start thinking, you know what? I think we have a psychic connection between Jane and me. I think of Jane, psychically, she can tell that I'm thinking of her and she calls me. And that's why every time I think of her, she calls, right? But of course, what you didn't notice was all the times you thought about Jane and she didn't call. Let's say there were 20 of those. And all the times she called when you weren't thinking about her. There's 30 of those. And again, suddenly in the context of all these other numbers, the fact that there were 3 times you thought about her and she called later that day doesn't seem all that special, right? I mean, sometimes you think about Jane, sometimes Jane calls, and sometimes those things are going to tend to overlap by coincidence alone. And that's probably what's happening here. But if you have the belief that you and Jane share some extrasensory connection, right? Then because of that belief, you engage in confirmation biases. You only pay attention to those 3 instances when you thought about her and she called, and you ignore all the times you thought about her and she didn't call, and all the times she called when you weren't thinking about her. So it leads you to this wrong conclusion that, in fact, there's a relationship between these events when, in fact, there isn't. So hopefully you can see that because of these heuristics and because of these biases that we've discussed in class, people will often form wrong conclusions on the basis of their reliance on those heuristics. But I guess the question really that we're faced with is, does any of this actually matter, right? I mean, most of the examples I gave you were pretty benign examples, right? Okay, so people think that a certain sequence of coin flips is more likely to occur than getting all heads. Like who really cares about that, right? But I would argue that, in fact, there are many, many ways in which people's failures to think properly about the conclusions they're coming up with and their reliance on heuristics, in fact, has really serious negative consequences. And I'll give you a couple examples. So obviously, after the terrorist attacks of 9/11, a lot of people were fearful about airline travel, which makes sense, right? I mean, you just had a number of planes that were crashed, killing people inside. In other words, these events happened recently, right? And so we know from the availability heuristic that when people are trying to figure out how likely is it that I'm going to die in a plane crash, well, let's see, how easily can I think of plane crashes happening? And right after 9/11, it was really easy to think of plane crashes, obviously, right? So those examples came to mind easily. As a consequence, people overestimated their likelihood of dying in a plane crash. As a consequence, because they relied on the availability heuristic, which led them to overestimate the likelihood of dying in a plane crash, people started driving to their destinations instead of flying, right? Because they were fearful of flying. The problem is that on a mile by mile basis, driving is much riskier than flying. It's way, way riskier than flying. And as a consequence, what that means is there were a number of people who died in car crashes because they were afraid of dying in plane crashes. Okay, so by relying on, in this case, the availability heuristic, it led people to engage in a suboptimal behavior. They decided to drive instead of to fly, even though flying is way safer, right? So it led people to die in car crashes. I think you can even see this in the transportation statistics that after 9/11, there was a bump in road accidents, I believe, road fatalities for this reason, because people were driving more often. So a failure to understand how these heuristics can lead to wrong conclusions led people to die, basically. Okay. In the 1990s, terrorists killed about 2,500 people worldwide in the entire decade. Accidents kill about that many people per week just in the US alone, right? And so when we think about what's more likely to kill us, a terrorist attack or an accident, we are way more likely to die in an accident, like way, 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 way more likely to die in a car accident, right? But because terrorist attacks are very salient when they happen, whereas we kind of get used to car accidents, when a terrorist attack occurs, those examples come to mind easily and we overestimate their frequency. And it's easy to find that the same people who are scared of dying in a terrorist attack, a lot of those people are the same people who are texting on their phones while driving, which is like way more dangerous or way more likely to kill you, right? So people in general, people are just really, really bad at understanding probabilities, at assessing risk in general. And part of the reason for that is because of their reliance on these heuristics and biases. I'll give you another example. A number of years ago, I think, when was this? Was it the late 90s, I think? A researcher by the name of Andrew Wakefield published a paper in a scientific journal where he claimed that there was a link between being vaccinated and later developing autism. Okay, he was saying that vaccines were causing autism, basically. So he published this paper, which really scared people, right? Because especially parents, because if you have children and you get them vaccinated, you don't want to put them at risk of certain disorders. So it's kind of scared a lot of people, right? It led people to stop vaccinating their kids. The problem is that over the next number of years, a number of other researchers tried to replicate this finding, and no one was ever able to. No one else was ever able to show a link between vaccinations and autism. In fact, people started to research this more and more. What they discovered is that Andrew Wakefield seemed to have made up a lot of his data. In fact, he had some severe conflicts of interest. He was actually working to sue vaccine companies on behalf of parents of kids who had developed autism. And so he had this motive to fabricate data because that would help him win his court cases. It was later found out he engaged in a whole bunch of unethical practices. As a consequence, his authors, his co-authors on that paper all withdrew their names. The journal actually retracted the paper, which is a very rare thing to happen. The journal retracted the paper, and Wakefield, the author, lost his medical license as a consequence. Okay, so basically, the whole idea that vaccines cause autism has been completely discredited, right? But it took a number of years to discredit it. In that meantime, before it had been discredited, a number of people were talking about the dangers of vaccines. So here's an example. This is Jim Carrey actually talking about vaccines and how they can cause problems. The problem, though, is that when later on people came along and completely discredited the underlying reason for people's beliefs, that one paper that these beliefs all came from, what happened? Did people just abandon their beliefs? Well, no, because of what's called belief perseverance, right? That once you have a belief in something, people generate their own reasons for why that belief is true. And so what happened is that in the years between when Andrew Wakefield published this paper and when he was finally discredited years later, people like Jim Carrey and others had come up with all sorts of reasons why vaccines could cause autism. And so that when later the initial, their initial belief was discredited, right? The reason for why they developed that belief in the first place was completely discredited. Because they had self-generated all these reasons why that belief is true, people still tended to cling on to that belief. So we know now that vaccines do not cause autism, and yet there are a whole bunch of people who still claim that they do. And as a consequence, some people are not vaccinating their children. And as a consequence, some diseases which had been effectively eradicated have now started to come back. Kids have started to die from preventable diseases because their parents mistakenly believed that vaccines cause autism. So Bill Gates has it right here when he says this: it's an absolute lie that vaccines have killed thousands of kids. And so the people who go and engage in those anti-vaccine efforts, they kill children. Okay. So again, what we're seeing is that by relying on things like belief perseverance and confirmation bias, these natural cognitive mechanisms that we have, that led people to form wrong conclusions that vaccines cause autism, which led them not to vaccinate their kids, which led to deaths among those kids. When you were trying to diagnose something, like if you want to diagnose someone in terms of an illness that they have, a mental illness, generally speaking, computers or software programs that have been properly programmed with past data do a much better job at assessing, at diagnosing people than do actual doctors, psychiatrists, and other professionals, which seems a little bit weird, right? It seems like if you have a bunch of symptoms and you want to be diagnosed, it seems like you want to talk to a professional, like a doctor, right? And you tell them your problems and blah, blah, blah. What this is indicating, what these findings indicate, is that in fact, the better thing to do is to use some sort of program, software program, that as long as it's been entered correctly with real data from the past, that software program will do a much better job at diagnosing you than the actual person will, the actual doctor professional will. And the reason why that's the case is because doctors, just like everybody else, succumb to confirmation biases and belief perseverance, and they rely on heuristics, right? And so what happens is that a doctor might come up with an initial tentative diagnosis, which is wrong, but because of confirmation biases, they're only looking for information that confirms that initial diagnosis, and they're not willing to abandon that diagnosis when they come across contradictory information. But computers, they don't fall prey to things like that. They don't fall prey to confirmation biases and belief perseverance, et cetera. As a consequence, actual human beings, they tend to be biased by these things, right? And therefore, computers tend to outperform humans on almost any task that involves diagnosing something. I am seeing the chat, by the way. I see that some people are talking about that. I am seeing the chat, so if you do have questions, I can answer them. Okay. So what does all this mean in the grand scheme of things? Okay. And by the way, sorry, Miguel, you asked, so this was caused by the experimenter's bias or confirmation bias. I'm not sure if you're talking about the vaccines and autism thing. If you're talking about the vaccines and autism paper, it was actually worse than that. Experimenter bias occurs when we are trying to be objective, but we accidentally mess up our experiments. It looks like Andrew Wakefield was basically lying about a bunch of stuff. So it's worse than experimenter biases. It's like outright fraud almost. All right, what's the difference between illusory correlations and confirmation bias? So the confirmation bias refers to the fact that when we have a belief, we look only for information to support it, right? And we interpret information, ambiguous information, to be consistent with our beliefs. An illusory correlation is a little bit more than that. An illusory correlation is a false belief that two things are related that in fact are not. Now, confirmation biases can play into illusory correlations, right? So if you think that, let's say, I'll use the same example, that autism and vaccines are related, in other words, that vaccines cause autism, then confirmation biases will tend to lead you to look only for information that confirms that belief, which ultimately results in you thinking those two things are related when in fact they're not. So they're definitely related ideas, but they talk about slightly different things. Okay, so part of the reason I like this part of the class is because I want to help people think more clearly. And so I want to give you some tips to stop screwing up in terms of how you think about things, okay? And so the first general idea here is that you should try to be as objective as possible when researching an issue, okay? Meaning you should be thinking about both sides of an issue. Don't just be looking for information that you already agree with, right? Because that's going to create this bubble where you're not really exposing yourself to contradictory information or contradictory data, and that can lead you to form these wrong conclusions. So you really should be trying to think about both sides. If you are taking a certain position, a moral position, a philosophical position, whatever, you should expose yourself to the best, strongest arguments of the other side, okay? Just like you're exposing yourself to the best arguments on your own side. And furthermore, you should be prepared to abandon your beliefs if evidence requires it. Now, that's a hard thing to do because once you believe something, it becomes part of your self-concept, right? Once we believe something, it's part of who we are at sort of a fundamental level. And if we were to simply change a belief that we've had for the past 10 or 15 or 20 years, then we're changing a fundamental part of our self-concept. So not only do we have to admit that, oh, we made bad decisions over the past 10, 15, 20 years. We made a bad decision when we adopted this belief in the first place, which we don't want to admit because it hurts our self-esteem. But also we have to change the very nature of who we are in a sense, right? We're sort of abandoning a part of us. As a consequence, people are really, it's really hard for people to abandon beliefs that they've had. And it's that failure to abandon those beliefs, though, that can lead people to dig into those false beliefs. So to avoid that, you should be willing and prepared to abandon your beliefs if evidence requires it. To the extent that you could take your ego out of it, which again is a very, very hard thing to do. But to the extent that you can do that, you will make better decisions later on, right? I mean, because you know this, when someone challenges your beliefs, our natural tendency is to get defensive. I mean, that's my natural tendency, and I'm sure it's most of yours as well, right? There's this feeling of defensiveness that arises. And that feeling of defensiveness arises in part because of this desire that we have to think of ourselves as really good decision makers, and it hurts our ego. So if we can remove our ego, we'll make better decisions. The second tip to stop screwing up is something that's come up at a few different points in this section, which is that we really need to be paying more attention to statistics and base rates when making decisions. Now, as long as those statistics come from a reliable source that performed properly, et cetera, as long as the stats are done correctly, then those stats are much more reliable than our own feelings or hunches or intuition. Now, remember, earlier in the semester, I talked about how your feelings, your hunches, your intuitions, your gut is good when you're talking about your preferences, what you like on a subjective sense, right? But when we're talking about objective reality, what's true or what's not true, we don't want to go with our hunches because our hunches can fall prey to these biases. That's when we want to rely on things like statistics, right? And it's partly for this reason that I think that people should have a basic understanding, at the very least, of statistics because it helps you to evaluate claims. Right? It will help you to make better decisions later on if you can understand some of the basic stats behind people's claims. But in any case, we need to stop ignoring those base rates. We see that we do that when we look at the availability heuristic, at the representativeness heuristic. We tend to ignore those things, right? So stop ignoring that information. So just to summarize, our search for knowledge is influenced by the pre-existing beliefs that we have. Okay. For instance, the fact confirmation bias, when you have an existing belief, confirmation bias means that it leads you to look only for confirmatory information, to interpret ambiguous information in light of those beliefs. It leads you to avoid abandoning those beliefs when the evidence requires it. That's belief perseverance. And it can even lead to self-fulfilling prophecies, where a false belief can lead us to behave in a way that elicits the very behaviors we expect out of another person, which can lead us to falsely confirm our initial beliefs in the first place. And in general, as a general theme that is going to pop up again and again in this course, is that people tend to be cognitive misers. We tend to be cheap with our cognitive efforts, right? We don't like to think in depth, usually, if we can avoid it. And as a consequence, we rely on things like heuristics, shortcut judgments. But those heuristics can often lead to the incorrect response, right? So we've seen how people can develop false beliefs based on false evidence via availability heuristics, representativeness heuristics, etc. Okay, any questions here before I move on to a new topic? Okay, I'm not seeing anything. In that case, let's talk about social cognition in a social environment. So last class, I mentioned that social cognition is sort of the interface between social psychology and cognitive psychology. And I mentioned that we're going to focus the first part of that section, which is everything we've talked about so far, on the cognitive aspect, how we think about things, and how the heuristics that we use can lead us to wrong conclusions. And now we're going to talk about applying social cognition specifically to a social context. In other words, we're going to be talking about how we think about other people for this section. So let's take a look at this. On April 20th, 1999, two students, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, went to their high school, Columbine High School, armed with numerous weapons, and opened fire on other students and teachers at that school. At the end of the day, they killed, I believe it was 23 people, including themselves, in the worst mass school shooting in American history, I believe, at the time anyway. Now, when this happened, obviously, people wanted to know why it happened. Now, you guys are probably too young to, most of you, if almost all of you, are too young to actually remember what happened, or a lot of you may not have even been born, actually. But I remember Columbine. I remember when the school shooting happened. And after it happened, there were people all over the media that were giving explanations as to why the school shooting happened. And I want to give you some of the explanations that they gave. So all the explanations I'm going to give you are real explanations that people gave for why the two kids engaged in this mass shooting. Well, what some people said at first was that, well, this is due to increasing liberalism in our schools. And had we not been teaching this liberalism, then these kids wouldn't have committed the shooting. Or no, it wasn't liberalism. It was the fact that we prohibited school prayer, or at least the fact that the teachers can't lead a school prayer in public schools because of the separation of church and state. And had we not prohibited school prayer, then these kids would have had a moral path forward and they wouldn't have committed the shooting. Or it wasn't that, it was the fact that they were playing Dungeons and Dragons, and Dungeons and Dragons can lead people to lose track of reality and fantasy, and they can't separate one from the other. Or no, it wasn't that, it was neo-Nazism. The shooting happened on the anniversary of Hitler's birthday, April 20th. And so what these kids were doing, they were influenced by this neo-Nazi ideology. Or it wasn't that, it was Gothic culture. These kids came from a culture where I guess in Gothic culture, that people don't respect life or something like that, right? And so it was the Gothic culture that led the kids to not respect the lives of others. Or it wasn't that, it was the fact that they were playing video games. So at home, these kids had created video games where they had input their classmates' faces into the video games and they could shoot them, right? So they were basically shooting their classmates in these video games at home. Or it wasn't that, it was the fact that they were exposed to violent movies. I mean, Columbine happened really soon after the Matrix, the original Matrix came out. And in the Matrix, they had these really long black trench coats, and that's what the killers wore in the Columbine shooting as well. So they're clearly influenced by violent movies. Or no, it wasn't that. It was actually music. Marilyn Manson took the brunt of this. According to some people, Marilyn Manson's music taught people to not care about other people. Or wasn't that the kids were on prescription drugs for antidepressant, and one of the side effects of these prescription drugs can be having these homicidal thoughts, and so it's the drugs that did it. Or wasn't that is the fact that the kids were bullied and they were taking revenge on the people who bullied them. So it's bullying that was the ultimate cause of this. Or it wasn't that it's the fact they had access to guns. Had the kids not had access to guns in the first place, they couldn't have committed the shooting, right? So it's the fact that the kids had access to guns. Or it wasn't that it was the fact that the parents of those kids neglected them. And as a consequence, they weren't aware of the warning signs that the kids were exhibiting that they're going to be committing this shooting. Or wasn't that, it was the fact that the schools didn't have enough money, and because they were underfunded, they didn't have money for things like guidance counselors and therapists that would be able to pick up on these red flags, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In fact, there was no shortage of explanations, right? There were dozens and dozens of explanations as to why these kids did what they did. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, are the explanations that people come up with to explain why someone else did something. Because we really have this fundamental desire, this almost need to explain other people's behavior, just like we saw in Columbine, where people have this need to come up with explanations. And even though there might have been no evidence to support their beliefs, they still have this tendency to want to come up with explanations for other people's behavior, especially when their behavior is out of the ordinary. No, these are not necessarily availability heuristics, Diana. These are something a little different. So what we're going to talk about today is that what attribution theories are the theories that social psychologists have to explain how other people explain other people's behavior, if you're following me, okay? So for instance, let's say that you, on your way to class, let's say last Thursday, on the way to class, you ran into a friend of yours, right? And in the hallway, and then that person walked right by you, didn't even acknowledge you, just ignored you. Now, when that happens, you've got to think about why that happened. Why did they ignore you? Did they ignore you because that's part of who they are? They're kind of a rude person. They just didn't want to say hi to you because they're just a rude person. Or maybe they didn't say hi to you because there's a lot of things going on in their life that they were thinking about, and they were distracted by it. Like you're going to an exam, right? So maybe this person was really concerned with doing well in the exam. So they're just like thinking ideas in their heads. So they're distracted and didn't see you, right? There's a couple different explanations that we can come up with for why that person ignored you. And so attribution theories explain how you came up with an explanation for why that person ignored you. And we're going to talk first off about the most famous attribution theory, which developed in the late 60s and early 70s, which is known as Kelly's attribution theory. This is named after the researcher. His name is Harold Kelly. Now, what Kelly was interested in is how do we arrive at what's known as an internal attribution versus an external attribution? Okay. Now, an internal attribution means that we're explaining someone's behavior in terms of their personality or their disposition or their attitude or something internal to the person themselves. So if you think that your friend just ignored you in the hallway because they're a rude person, then you're making an internal attribution, right? You're explaining their behavior in terms of their personality. On the other hand, we can make external attributions, which means that we're explaining people's behavior, not in terms of their personality, but in terms of something external to them, right? To something in their immediate environment, to something in the situation that they're in. So if you think that your friend ignored you because they were distracted because they were thinking about the upcoming exam, that would be an external attribution. You're explaining their behavior in terms of something external to the person. It's really due to the exam. That's why they ignored you. So what leads you, when you make attributions for other people's behavior, what leads you to make an internal attribution versus an external attribution? That's what Harold Kelly is interested in here with his attribution theory. So let me give you another example, and I'll walk you through what his theory says. And first off, let me mention that in the 1960s and 70s in social psychology, it was generally believed at the time that people were quite rational. Now, we just spent like a whole couple hours talking about social cognition and all these biases and heuristics, right? But those biases and heuristics were only really appreciated in the mid to late 70s. So prior to that, in the early 70s, when this theory came out, we were still under the belief that people behaved pretty rationally in general. And so that idea is reflected in Kelly's attribution theory. His theory is going to, as you're going to see, it's going to basically assume that people are rational and putting together information in the most rational possible way to come to a rational conclusion, as we're going to see. Okay. So let's imagine that your friend comes to you and starts raving about this movie. They love this new movie that just came out. Okay. Now, you've got to attribute their behavior to something. Why are they raving about this movie? Are they raving about the movie because the movie itself is really good? That would be an external attribution, right? They're raving about it because it's the movie that's good. Or are they raving about the movie because your friend has absolutely no taste in movies whatsoever and they love everything that they ever see? That would be an internal attribution, right? So what determines whether you make that internal or external attribution? Well, according to Kelly, what you do is you ask yourself basically 3 questions. And depending on your answers to those 3 questions, that will lead you to an internal or an external attribution. So the first question that you would ask yourself is what's known as the consensus question. Okay, the consensus question is, do other people behave the same way in this situation? So if other people also saw this movie, are they also raving about the movie or not? So if we answer this question, yes, that other people behave the same way in the situation, then we would say that the behavior is high in consensus, right? If everyone raves about the movie, everyone's in agreement, there's a consensus, it's high in consensus. If we would answer this question with no, that most people don't behave the same way, your friend raves about the movie, but most other people who see it hate the movie, then the behavior is low in consensus. And as we're going to see, the way that we answer each of these 3 questions as being high or low is going to determine our attribution. Okay, so make sure you note that. If you answer yes, that means it's high in consensus. No means it's low in consensus. Okay, once we ask ourselves the consensus question, we then ask ourselves the distinctiveness question. The distinctiveness question is, does this specific person behave the same way in other similar situations? So when your friend goes and sees any other movie, do they always rave about every single movie that they see? Or do they usually hate most movies, but they love this one? Now, what makes this slightly confusing is that if you answer the distinctiveness question with a yes, so this person behaves this way in other situations, then that means that it's not very distinct, this current behavior, right? If they rave about this movie and they rave about every single movie they see, then this is not a distinct occurrence. So if you answer yes to the distinctiveness question, then the behavior is low in distinctiveness. If you answer no, this person does not behave the same way in the situation, then the behavior is high in distinctiveness. Okay, so that's a little bit backwards from the consensus. With consensus, yes means high, and with distinctiveness, yes means low. And then finally, you'd ask yourself what's known as the consistency question, which is, does this person behave the same way in all situations of the same type? So if your friend sees this same movie multiple times, do they love it every time they see it? Or do they like it the first time and they hate it the second time and they're mediocre on it the third time? Are they consistent or not? So if you answer yes to the consistency question, then the behavior is high in consistency. If you answer no, then the behavior is low in consistency. So basically, once you ask yourself all 3 of these questions, you now have a behavior, your friend's raving about a movie, that has a pattern of being either high or low in each of these 3 topics, right? It's either high or low in consensus, high or low in distinctiveness, high or low in consistency. Now, by the way that I remember this is that you see the 3 questions, there's 2 that start with the letter C and 1 that starts with the letter D. So I always think about, for the questions that start with C, high means, or yes means high. And for the odd one out, distinctiveness, yes means low. Now, I don't know if that's going to help you guys or not, but that's how I remember it. Okay. So C questions, yes means high. D questions, yes means low. But in any case, you now have a pattern of either high or low for each of these three concepts. And the pattern that you get is going to lead you to form a specific type of attribution in this way. So if you have come to the conclusion that the behavior that your friend engaged in is high in consensus, high in distinctiveness, and high in consistency, then that leads us to make an external attribution. So the external attribution here is that your friend likes the movie because the movie's actually good, right? So if we think about this, this makes a lot of sense, okay? Because high in consensus means that your friend likes this movie and everyone else likes the movie as well. High in distinctiveness means your friend hates most movies, but really loves this one. And high in consistency means that your friend always loves the movie every time they see it. Well, obviously that sounds like what's happening is that the movie's really good, right? That's why we're making an external attribution. On the other hand, if you come up with the following pattern of attributions, if you have come to the conclusion that your friend's behavior is low in consensus, low in distinctiveness, and high in consistency, then we make an internal attribution. Your friend likes the movie because your friend has no taste in movies. They're easy to please. They like everything that they see, which again makes sense when you think about it, right? Because low in consensus means that your friend is raving about the movie, but no one else likes the movie. Your friend's the only one. Low in distinctiveness means that your friend likes every single movie they see. And high in consistency means they love this movie every time they see it. You can kind of tell what's going on here. What's going on here is that your friend just loves everything. Your friend has no taste in movies. You're making an internal attribution. There are, of course, a number of other possible patterns that you could get as well. You could end up with a situation that you think is high in consensus and low in distinctiveness and low in consistency or whatever, right? And under any other pattern other than the two that I'm presenting to you right now, any other pattern that you get, then it leads to an ambiguous attribution. It's not clear as to how you should attribute their behavior. Sure, I can repeat the tip. The way that I remember it is that the C questions, let me just go back. There's two C questions and one D question, right? So for the two C questions, if you answer yes, then that means it's high. So if you answer yes to the consensus question or yes to the consistency question, and that means that those behaviors are high in consensus and consistency. For the odd question out, the one that does not begin with a C, it's flipped, right? So if you answer yes to the distinctiveness question, that means the behavior is low in distinctiveness. Now, that's just my own personal way of remembering it. You guys can use whatever way works best for you. But what you should see, or I guess what I should say is, what Kelly's really doing with his attribution theory is he's telling you what you do automatically, okay? He's not saying that you literally ask yourself in your head the consensus, distinctiveness, and consistency questions, okay? What he's saying is that you use that information at an implicit level. You automatically combine that consensus, distinctiveness, and consistency question at an automatic level, which leads to this automatic attribution. But we are really good at these attributions. We don't really have to think this through. Well, Kelly's just describing what you do naturally and automatically. And so on the next slide, what I'm going to do is give you an example, okay? And it should be obvious to you from reading the example what's actually happening here. And Kelly is just saying, he's explaining how you came to that natural conclusion. That's going to be relatively easy for you to do, I think. So here's what I mean by this. So imagine the following scenario. Carmen and John are dancing. John is stepping all over Carmen's feet. He doesn't normally step on women's feet when he dances, but every time he dances with Carmen, he steps on her feet. Other men also step on Carmen's feet when she dances with them. So my question to you is, just reading that paragraph without thinking about anything, what's happening here? Why is John stepping on Carmen's feet? And you can write it in chat. Right. Right, so you guys have it, right? Carmen's a bad dancer. That's obviously what's happening here. You guys make that attribution like automatically just from reading that paragraph. It's really easy to do, right? You didn't literally ask yourself consensus, distinctiveness, and consistency questions to come up with an answer. You just know the answer. All that Kelly is saying is that the way that you came up with that automatic answer, that Carmen's a bad dancer, is you implicitly, if you effectively use consensus and distinctiveness and consistency information, you just didn't explicitly ask yourself those questions, okay? But we could break this down, right? So what we could do is say this. So let's look at the consensus question. Let's say that we're trying to attribute John's behavior. Why is John stepping all over Carmen's feet? Okay. So the consensus question is, if John is stepping on her feet, do other men also step on Carmen's feet? And we would say, yes, of course they do. That's what it says in the last line here. Other men also step on Carmen's feet. So if you answer yes to a consensus question, then it's high in consensus, right? Let's look at the distinctiveness question. Okay, so the distinctiveness question is, well, if John is stepping on Carmen's feet, excuse me, does John step on other women's feet when he dances with them? Okay, well, it says he doesn't normally step on women's feet when he dances. So therefore, you would answer no to the distinctiveness question, right? And if you answer no to the D question, that means it's high in distinctiveness. So it's a highly distinct behavior, right? So that's where you went wrong there, Miguel. You were right that it's high in consistency and consensus, but it's actually also high in distinctiveness as well. And then you can ask yourself the consistency question. Does John step on Carmen's feet every time he dances with her? Yep, every time he dances with Carmen, he steps on her feet, right? So it's high in consistency, right? And as we saw from the prior slide, if you come up with an attribution that's high in consensus and high in distinctiveness and high in consistency, then you would make an external attribution, meaning John's not stepping on Carmen's feet because he's a bad dancer. He's stepping on her feet because she's a bad dancer. Okay, so again, you don't have to go through each of those 3 steps explicitly, right? When you come up with this attribution, you are so good at this, you do it naturally. And again, all Kelly's doing is saying, when you came up with that attribution, you came up with it because you incorporated these 3 types of information into your response. And if it was flipped, then it would be internal. No, it's not flipped. In an internal attribution is as if a behavior is low in consensus, low in distinctness, but still high in consistency. So the consistency doesn't flip for an internal attribution. Okay, are there any questions on Kelly's attribution theory here? It's not that no matter what, consistency will be high. You can have situations where consistency is low. The problem is that there's only a clear attribution that we can make under those 2 patterns, right? So if I go back here, we can clearly make an external attribution when we answer high, high, and high, okay? And we can clearly come up with an internal attribution when we figure that the patterns of behavior are low, low, and high. For any other pattern, it's not clear how we make attributions. It gets a lot more complex. Okay, if you have a behavior that's high in consensus and low in distinctness and low in consistency, it's not really clear to the person what the attribution should be. So for the only 2 clear attributions, there's very specific patterns that we come up with. If you look at Carmen's side, it'll be an internal attribution, right? Yeah, so if you were to look at it from Carmen's side, you're right, then it would be an internal attribution. That's right. So if John's stepping on Carmen's feet, yeah, then basically you ask yourself, do other people also step on Carmen's feet? Well, yes. Does Carmen always have her feet stepped on by people? You can do the same thing, do the same analysis from Carmen's side, and you would come up with an internal attribution. That's absolutely correct. Yeah, so any other pattern would be ambiguous, and so it wouldn't lead to a clear attribution. That's correct. So hopefully you can see what I kind of mentioned a minute ago, which is that Kelly, who was influenced by the zeitgeist of the time, was under the impression that people were very rational decision makers. And so people could incorporate relevant information. Like if you want to make an internal or an external attribution, you kind of need to know the consensus, the distinctiveness, the consistency questions, right? You can combine that information to come up with a logical attribution. And so again, you can see this theory sort of presupposes that people are able to make these rational decisions. But this theory came out, as I said, around in the early 1970s, late 60s, early 70s. And only a few years later did people start to realize that, in fact, we don't always make rational decisions. And as a consequence, some other research was done into some attributional biases that people have. And that is what I'm going to discuss after we go on break. So let's take a break right now. Let's reconvene at 4:40. So that's about 8 minutes from now. Okay. So at 4:40, we'll start talking about some attributional biases. I will see you guys then.